Welcome back to the program. Joining me now from Melbourne, the Shadow Parliamentary Secretary, Michael Danby. Thanks very much for your time. I want to go first to a column that you wrote this week about Australia's intelligence sharing deal with Iran. You raised some concerns about this. You have raised them before, but what are now your main concerns? Well,
there hasn't been much of a public debate on what Julie Bishop agreed with the Iranians. These are my views. This is there hasn't even been a wide debate in the opposition, but we have a very strong view, for instance, in the Parliament on the Iranian-sponsored proxy Hezbollah. That's classified as a terrorist organisation by the Intelligence Committee, and I think would be odd if we want to intelligence share with Iran, which is at the same time running an organisation classified by the Australian Parliament as a terrorist organisation.
So should we be sharing any intelligence with Iran, including intelligence that pertains to Islamic State and fighting them?
Well, you know, they're good questions to ask. What's the extent of this deal? Who authorised it? Was it discussed at Cabinet? I know they've been having a lot of very acrimonious Cabinet discussions recently, but I think a lot of Conservatives forget people in the opposition are sort of a bit alarmed at this sort of sudden, you know, going from Iran's throats, where we were putting autonomous sanctions on them, to their feet in sharing intelligence. You know, if it's some minor things over immigration, perhaps that might be okay, but I don't know the extent of this deal, and there hasn't been enough public discussion of it.
There are indications that the United Nations will loosen sanctions on Iran if the US is able to broker a deal on nuclear in Iran. You believe that Australia, in that case, should still maintain its current sanctions?
Well, Australia is not a sort of pale imitation of any other country. We're a proud independent country, and we should evaluate ourselves whether the verification of this nuclear arrangement is going to be free and untrammelled. If the International Atomic Energy Agency is able to verify this agreement, then I think a lot of its critics will be satisfied. But Australia should establish that itself.
Okay, I want to move on to the budget and reports today of this $100 billion hole in the budget as a result of unpassed measures through the Senate. Does Labor take any responsibility for that? Matthias Cormann just said this was Bill Shorten's black hole.
Well, any government which legislates changes and bases budgets on measures that they know they can't get through is irresponsible. It's hardly Labor's fault when we have publicly announced policies and announce we're not going to support certain measures in the Senate that the poor old government can't get its legislation through. Let's remember the previous government, Julia Gillard, received a lot of criticism, but legislation, more than 500 pieces of legislation were passed, including with us not having control of the Senate. I think you know, you can't expect Labor to support the Conservatives and their new allies in the Greens putting petrol taxes on people that will raise the cost of living for the average person and sort of not say anything about it. It's of course we would do that, and it's up to the government to get its own legislation through.
What about, though, the legislation that Labor supported before the election? Now, that legislation was tied to the mining tax, but still, Labor supported it. As the Finance Minister pointed out, some $6 billion worth of it, more than that. Why not support that?
Well, I mean, you make the point. It was tied to the mining tax, and we're not going to support legislation that regressively influences the lives of ordinary Australians. It's not for us to support those kind of changes to Medicare that the government still wants to prosecute, their changes to pensions, and this new petrol tax that they're putting on the average Australian. Sorry, Labor is in a situation post the election where we see what the Liberals' real plan is, and we're not going to support it.
Just moving on to this citizenship issue, We know that today 37 backbenchers from the government have written to the Prime Minister urging him to forge ahead with that tougher stance on citizenship, allowing a government to strip, for example, a second-generation Australian of their citizenship, even if they don't have one for another country. What's your view on all of this? Do you believe that that measure is too harsh? Should it just apply to dual citizens?
Let's be clear on this, David. Labor has supported both with financial support for the security services and in legislation every serious measure that the government has presented us with. Of course, we're willing to look at changes to the Citizenship Act as far as they affect dreadful people who have dual citizens who could perhaps be in other places. But we've got to see the legislation. And as for taking the citizenship away from Australians who only have singular citizenship, who are Australians like us, well, the Cabinet seems pretty divided. They didn't see a discussion paper, according to Foreign Minister Julie Bishop. Even Barnaby Joyce and George Brandis are opposed to it. How can we expect the Labor Party to support it when the Liberals are so divided themselves? We need to see the legislation, any sensible measure to protect the safety of Australian people. The Labor Party has been very responsible. Everyone in national security circles in Canberra has commended, even the Prime Minister has previously commended the opposition for supporting it on all kinds of legislation. I think Bill Shorten and Mark Dreyfus have been entirely responsible in this whole raft of areas, and they will recommend to us if they get sensible legislation from the government.
And just finally and briefly, if you would, on same-sex marriage, you now support changes to the Marriage Act. Tony Abbott and Bill Shorten both now agree that a bipartisan approach is the way forward. What's then the point of the partisan bill on Monday that's co-signed by Bill Shorten and Tanya Plibersek?
Well, if Bill and Tanya hadn't brought this forward, this would not be being discussed. There's a clear majority in the opposition in support of this, and there's a substantial group in the Liberal Party who support marriage equality as well. If the Prime Minister was to take his heavy hand off the Liberal Party room and allow them to have a conscience vote, I'm confident Australia would join the rest of the world in supporting gender equality. The opposition and Bill Shorten putting this up has clearly made the Prime Minister's heavy hand in stopping this conscience vote going ahead. It's clear that that's the issue. There are the numbers there for it to pass. It's only the Liberals being held back by a Prime Minister who's opposed to marriage equality.
Michael Danby, thanks for your time. Great to have your company.
Thank you.